What a wonderful chance we have today to be together and to be in the presence of Shaikh al Mashaik. I have to say, one of the great joys of my life has been the possibility of listening to Shaikh al Mashaik late into the night sometimes, sitting over cups of tea and hearing all of Shaikh al Mashaik's recollections and his observations on a whole array of subjects. More recently, I have come to consider myself as perhaps too exclusively fortunate in that regard. I feel that there's a privilege there that ought to be shared. I know that some of you have had this chance and regard it as being as precious as anything can be. But it's rare that such an opportunity arises. And today we have presence of Shaikh al Mashaik. And for this reason, I thought to share the joy, rather than speaking myself, to invite you into a conversation with Shaikh al Mashaik and to pose some questions to him so that we can all listen to his perspective on subjects which are perhaps of interest to everyone here. Questions related to the history of the Sufi path, the special legacy of our Murshid, and what is needed now in the world. So I have 7 questions, and we'll see how far we get. So let's begin. And I'm very grateful to Shaikh al Mashaik for his willingness to respond to these queries. The first question concerns the phrase universal Sufism. No doubt many of you have heard this phrase, and you may know that Murshid used the word universal a number of times in his discourses, and certainly he used the word Sufism. But those two words don't exist strung together in any of the accounts of Murshid's lectures. And yet, in recent decades, this has become a popular phrase. So I wanted to ask Shaikh al Mashaik about it. Universal Sufism has become a popular label by which to characterize the Sufi legacy of Hazrat Inayat Khan. Shaikh al Mashaik, I noticed that you tend to use an alternate phrase, Indian Sufism.
Yeah, that's right.
Could you please share with us your understanding of which aspects of Murshid's teaching are characteristically Indian, or shall we say South Asian? Which aspects reflect his engagement with the modern Western circles in which he moved? And which aspects are universal in the sense of pertaining to the human experience in its widest geographical and historical dimensions?
Yes, well, that's quite a bit of question. Excuse me. There's quite a few questions, of course. Excuse me, I just have... In the first place, Sufism has been very long. And that also already answers one of the later parts of your question, has been characterized for decades on end, for Murshid Inayat Khan's time onwards, by the idea of the Sufi message and the Sufi messenger. And for that reflects a purely theosophical influence. As many of you probably know, a number of theosophists started joining the Sufi order in England during the First World War time, and rapidly gained a certain fairly emphatic voice in the Sufi community there, with as a result, when Muhyiddin Inayat Khan left London in 1920, many non-theosophical murids really left and kind of dispersed. They didn't still maintain, they tried to make personal contact with either from a point of view of human sanity or the point of view of culture, really to be very propitious, but just a process through which this new science was developing. So again, that is too much words to too little answer. But anyway, I think in that direction we would have to look, it seems to me.
Thank you for that. And now, if I may turn to a more personal subject, in India, as you know, it is said that the mother is the first guru, the father is the second guru, and the guru is the third guru.
Yes, yes.
So, Shaikh al Mashaik, would you be willing to tell us something you have learned about life from your mother and something you learned from your father?
Yes, well, it would be very difficult to give that in very concrete form, because everything that was present in our household, in our family, was there in a kind of way which was subtle, which was natural, which was not defined in a way. So when I start speaking and try to explain that, it gets a kind of contour, a kind of definition kind of description, which is not really the intention, but that's the only way of expressing it. There was in the house a certain attunement which was based on that idea of the togetherness of that great feudal tradition, that tradition of the Indian states represented by my father, and that kind of Frisian Dutch tradition, that Friesland in those days was the estate country of the Netherlands. And the cultures were not that far apart at all. The outlook of life and the disciplines which were observed, the mentality and the attitude we developed were very much, very, very close. In addition, there was one thing which was quite curious in my parents. They had an engagement which had lasted for 2 years. The official engagement lasted for two years, which of course is quite unusual for any normal engagement. But that was in a way because we have a funny Dutch expression to say that, but let me try to convey it into English. In a way, you know, all the Sufi movement thought him too good for her, and all, you know, fashionable The Hague thought her too good for him. And the troubles that these kind of the doubts and comments and criticisms incurred, of course, all came back on the head of my grandmother. And but the two young people themselves really didn't bother that much about it, but on the contrary, spent 2 years in writing to one another, in kind of, you know, trying exactly on values and on understandings and on everything to do with a kind of togetherness of two different language areas in any way, and in that sense, two different civilizations. How do you adjust to that? So the fact that they had 2 years of preparation before actually the marriage took place, and so the family relationship developed, was really a great benefit to them, I think. And so it would be very difficult to distinguish one from the other. I would say that what we learned from our mother was a great kind of subtlety of behavior, a subtlety of mentality, a subtlety of perception, and at the same time that enormous respect for Muhyiddin Inayat Khan. Of course, that was Muhyiddin Inayat Khan in 1921 happened to stay with her mother here in The Hague, And my mother came from finishing school in England and suddenly saw this remarkable Indian personality there in their own house, playing his veena in the evenings and being general and extraordinary kind of personality. So, and that impression of an overwhelming impression of such an illuminated personality, of such a great authority of the things of the spirit, that impressed her enormous. As she used to tell that one of the first times they had a joint dinner there, suddenly she saw Murshid's two eyes focused on her. And she thought, now Murshid knows everything about me already without one word being said. So to her, Murshid Inayat Khan was really the determining value of her spiritual life. In addition, of course, my father had very much the same attitude towards Murshid also. But still, Murshid was his elder brother. They had grown up from youngs together, and they had an enormous reverence for Murshid Inayat Khan, for Hazrat, as they used to say. But still, there was that very personal connection with the brother and everything with the brothers experienced together. I must have told you before that their meetings at the Oriental Room in Fazal Manzil during the 3 monthly summer schools in Suren was a regular feature in which they really together they could relax and speak their own, in those days it was Hindustani language, and digest their experiences of this kind of unfamiliar societies in which they were functioning. So that was there, and so there was that same kind of deep reverence for Murshid Inayat Khan, but at the same time also that sense of personal connection with the brother. So, but what it all amounted to, there's that same kind of subtlety, that kind of very kind of intelligent observation without really expressing much, but conveying much, by indications or by slight remarks or by things which just percolated in a way in the atmosphere, in words, in the general temper of our family life. That characteristic of my mother, and in a more explicit sense, of course, was that characteristic of my father. I must say we lived here in a kind of joint family divided in two households, one in one house, one into the other, but we constantly, especially still going up and down between the two all the time. And so the one was more Frisian, the one was more Indian. And the languages were shared. Of course, English was the dominant shared language, but the Frisian part spoke Dutch, the Indian part spoke Hindustani. So there was that kind of sense of togetherness of these different cultures. And that was, of course, quite strong in them as well. And I must say that my father's authority in this whole joint family was really complete. And there again, you didn't have to say anything, you didn't express anything, but everything was always referred to him, or what would he have thought about this, what would he say about that, etc. As far as my mother is concerned, I've always said you would have had to know my mother during the lifetime of my father and after my father's lifetime. So they were almost, well, one personality with so many different characteristics, because, I mean, that was her life with my father. And once he was no longer there, we see a general process of, in a sense, spiritualization, but on the other sense also a kind of detachment from things of life, although all other family members, especially the younger generation, very much tried to continue her interest in the outside life and in everything which was developing in the outer world. But again, those basic characteristics which we derived from our parents, my sister and me, were those which, in a sense, were shared. There were different nuances of a similar kind of cultural and psychological makeup. Again, too short, too superficial, excuse me.
far from superficial, beautifully deep in the resonance of the personalities that shaped your early life and which were in turn shaped by and fragranced by the presence of Murshid himself. So through them, Murshid has come down to us in the re-echoes of his being that are present in you. Now, let me just shift to another subject and ask, if a young person were to come to you and say, I've entered the Sufi path and I wish to devote my life to the remembrance of God and to serving my fellow human beings, but I don't know where to begin. How would you advise this new initiate? What way of life and regimen of practice would you recommend?
Well, I would always would not put a general rule on that. I would always try to find out what his attitude, his or her attitude and mentality was. If there was a certain religious inclination, which in a sense had been injured and had become a difficulty, and so they had that kind of dislike for the religious approach, I would have to take them to the idea of the social and the philosophical approach. Especially Moshe is so very rich in his social teachings as well. Then that would be one way of helping them. On the other hand, many people also, once they understand that the religious path is a collective horizontal path, whereas mysticism is an individual vertical path, once which belong together in a way, but which have their own dimension in which to develop. And so once they are clear about that, then generally they tend to be very open to Murshid's idea, where he develops this whole idea of religion from that which a certain revelation has taught one, the God, the personality of God, or God beyond personality, but an ultimate reality, etc. And on the other hand, what they themselves derive from that religion and, so to speak, implant in their own life, in their own heart, in their own attitude. It's not enough to believe in a God which your religion presents to you. That's fine if you want to go along that horizontal path of religion. But if you want to life of experience of mysticism, then you have to personalize that image which religion offers you into yourself. That is exactly the difference between, the idea of the love of God is precisely that, to take possession of that divine ideal in such a way that it fills your heart. And that is where that concept of the love of God, which is also so difficult for religious people to accept, to become fruitful. And then, of course, another thing, and that is a basic thing in Murshid Inayat Khan's teachings, that the creative moment of human development does not start in the mind's intellect, but starts in the intuition of the heart. And so allow the heart to have its own intuition. Start with your own imagination. Don't say, well, this is imagination, so it's not valid. There are two different things. Fantasy, fencing yourself, fantasy, that's no good. But apart from fantasy, there is imagination. The imagination créatrice, as one great French Orientalist has called us, the creative imagination, which every person, every artist in any case, as Murshid would insist, every inventor starts out from. The thing in which you start your life, you think, oh, I have a wonderful idea and I'm going to realize it. But that first idea was always intuition. Trust the intuitive element in the feeling. From that intuition in the heart, it can become a concept, an intellectual comprehension of the mind. There is where you work it out, but it's not where it starts. One's first choice in life, in a sense, is purely subjective, purely irrational, purely a matter of feeling. and, in other words, of intuition. And if that is the priority, then there also in your spiritual life, start out with something which is your own intuition, which may have its own imagery, but that imagery will turn into a reality, as it does not only to the artist, but to the inventor, not only to the artistic spirit, but as well to the scientific spirit. And we are being supported in this nowadays, as you know, by the most modern philosophy, which by the help of psychological insights nowadays tend to insist that even intellectual concepts are born from that impulse of personal taste, of personal understanding. So in that way, there is progress in the human philosophical thinking as well. It's not that the intellect and intuition are, so to speak, opposed to one another, and that as disciplines, they have to be distinguished, and thereby the intellect has to dominate everything which happens in outside life. Just recognize that both the intellectual concepts and, let us say, idealistic concepts like love, tolerance, beauty, name it, that all those proceed from an irrational, intuitive attunement of the heart, which the Sufi would say is the heart which is inspired by the life of the soul, the heart which is open to both to the outside world of the mind, but also to the inner world of the soul. And so there, I think one has to start trying to make these things clear to murids to the extent that's possible for them to absorb these kind of perspectives.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned the heart. Murshid has described the Sufi path as the path of the heart. And oftentimes, someone who comes to the door of Sufism comes in an injured state. In fact, those who have had it easy in life might never arrive at that door because all of their needs have been easily met and they're able to just glide along the surface of life. But those who have found themselves time and again disappointed, bereaved, left forlorn, find that their heart is breaking, and the conventional external answers provide no satisfaction. And so, almost as a last resort, they come to the path and look for a means of healing and renewal. They've come to discover in their brokenness that there's something of vaster significance than was ever recognized, but still it's not present. It needs to be realized. It needs to be reckoned with. And what's the means of doing so? So if someone would come to you in that state of brokenheartedness, what's the cure for the broken heart? How do you inculcate faith in someone who has met with disappointment after disappointment in life?
Yeah, the very fact that those people approach one already means that they are looking for something. They are feeling their way to something more positive. So beneath all their disappointments and frustrations, there is something reaching out. And one lets them talk, let's have all kind of discussions about their problems, etc. When that's all done, then something will emerge, maybe a slight ray of some hope, of some expectation, of some willingness to try again, to again start out from the basic element in the being, in the heart, in the depth of the heart, as from which they again try to wing themselves upwards. As you rightly say, very often heartbreak and disaster as a more ready-made kind of way of finding reality than, just gliding along the surface and expecting the easy life, which is one of the problems we experience today, of course.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to ask, when the time comes to leave this world, and let me hasten to say most sincerely that I hope and pray that you will physically outlive all of us.
Thank you very much. This is very generous.
But when the time comes, as it will come for all of us, when the time comes to leave this world, is there anything that you will wish to take with you into the world beyond? And how do you envision the odyssey that lies ahead for yourself and for all of us?
Well, that's a very subtle question indeed. I would say, in the first place, of course, that whole idea of death and departure and all that is very much that of the people who one leaves behind, because they are no longer able to communicate, nor able to believe or to feel that that person who they lost can be anywhere at all. I do not think it is that much of a tragedy for the person himself or herself, because it is a normal procedure of life from one state of being to another. And I think as people become old and become mature in this kind of concept, it is just a natural proceeding to a further stage of existence, whatever it be. Now, of course, what one would wish to take, what I would wish to take is let us say, a bouquet, a flower bouquet of all those whom you have loved and those who have loved you. I think that is a permanent riches which accompany one, which is one carries along with one's soul and in one's spirit, and which is the one thing which, yes, gives that kind of value, that pure value of affection, of love, of togetherness in that inner. It is always an inner focus, but it becomes all the more clear when the purely physical impediment is no longer there. So I think that is a great value one takes along with it, the love one has shared with those with whom one was in a close contact. That's one thing. And then another thing, that the procedure of going onwards into the inner life and into the further reality has, of course, been mapped out very carefully and, in a sense, in a very modern representation, but in an extremely clear representation in most different stages of the different paths. He speaks of the world of the jinn, he speaks of the world of the angels, he speaks of the world of the union of God. But here, in Murshid metaphysics, and you can think of the Soul Whence and Whither and different books and lectures which deal with the same subject, one also noticed that Murshid always keeps a reckoning with, let us say, the theosophical problem. The theosophists, they always wanted to ask for reincarnation, which was precisely what Murshid did not really want, because that is what keeps people from ultimate further development. Returning back to human life or whatever seemed an enormously attractive idea to the theosophists who lived in the Belle Epoque of late 19th century Europe. But of course, there's nothing to do with finding personal fulfillment in the development of the inner life in its further courses beyond this life. So that's Murshid then. And of course, there you might even say the Indian element is very strong in Murshid. You find that Murshid goes up in describing what the different stages in the metaphysical process, let us say the cosmological dimension of being, according to the esoteric one. In other words, the esoteric development is the practices people get in their different developments. You know, there are these 12 stages, as Murshid calls them, and obligingly for the sake of his theosophists, he mentioned that as 12 initiations, but in fact, they are not 12 initiations, they are just courses of development steps, as Murshid also calls them. And so there you get these different stages, Fana fi Shaykh, And then you get Fanafi Rasul, which essentially is a reflection of the jinn world in the cosmological scale. You can say that Murshid cosmology is an expansion of Murshid metaphysics, is an expansion in the cosmological sense of his esoteric view. There is that interrelation between the major and the minor. The minor development in the human being develops into the metaphysical reality beyond. So you get first that fana, giving up of your personal self in order to receive something from a teacher, which may be in first stage a human teacher, fanafi sheikh. But then you get that fanafi rasul. That means that the ideal, it is a process of ideal, no longer of physical expression, but of ideal kind of conceptualization. And that corresponds to that stage of the jinn world. Then you get the malak, the stage of the angels, which corresponds to Fanafi Rasul, Fanafillah, and that concept of the soul in the world of the angels, and then finding its unity in the Fanafillah, in the merging into the divine reality. So that course goes up to Fanafillah, the different Fana stages, that corresponding, as I said, to the 3 different stages of the esoteric development. Then, however, you get from Fanafillah, you go to Baqabillah. Baqabillah means that living in and as from the divine reality. One merges into divine reality, and as from there, in the Baqabillah, that again creates its own survival, so to speak. In a kind of unique passage, Moshe discusses this as an esoteric value, which happens in the human development. But then you have to remember that everything he says about the esoteric development is, in fact, projected on the metaphysical scale of Moshe as well. Now, Moshe Inayat Khan, in most of his work, stops not at Baqabillah, but at Fanafillah. Because if he went on to that, it would be very difficult for his theosophists not to equalize that, quite wrongly, but that's what he would do, with reincarnation. There's nothing to do with reincarnation. But remember that passage in the mystic relaxation, the lecture mystic, where Moshe compares the human soul with a drop of water, which comes from the mountains, which become a stream from the mountains, which then empties into a river, that stream empties into a river, that one drop continues in that river up to the ocean, and then merges into the ocean. That is the typical concept of Fanafillah. But then Murshid says, the very magnetism of that ocean draws that drop again into the life of its own. It is not absorbed. It is absorbed in the ocean, yes, but at the same time, it again draws itself together through the very magnetism of that ocean. And so there you have that Fanafillah at the ultimate metaphysical stage, where Fanafillah becomes the Baqabillah, that living in and as from. But what determines this? What determines this? People, after all, when we speak that the divine reality is both the transcendental ultimate reality of life, but at the same time, it is in the innermost of every human being, it lives as some innate sparkle of divine being. Then it means that every human being, in a sense, has that direction in himself to see and feel and become whatever he hopes he will develop into. And so there you have people who do not believe anything. And so, well, for them there will be nothing, okay? That's their way of life. Or you have people who think in very strongly religious terms. Well, those are terms of human relationships, which we take very different courses, of course. But at the same time, you have that kind of development of the human being where the human being loses himself in love. When the love for another being, for another something else, is so deep ingrained in the human being that becomes a kind of joy. To then again, as from that Makabila in which everything is merged, like that drop which draws power from the ocean, it becomes again magnetic. Again, it becomes a life as its own. So there you cannot say that a human life develops a standard. That is a kind of standard fate, destiny of the human being in ultimate reality. It is also what the immanence, the divine immanence in the human being in relation to divine transcendence has been able to develop out of its own, with itself, and with its identity, its identification with the divine on the one hand, and on the other hand, with that element of love which operated in his inner being. So, as I said, that element of Baqabillah is one which we may calculate, and which is, of course, in India, in the Indian philosophy, that's not so much evident, because there, of course, Advaita, the great discovery of the divine reality as the essence of one's own being, is, of course, an ultimate answer in itself, and a very valid fulfillment for all those who feel attuned to that direction. But at the same time, then we have in Hinduism the great counterweight to Shankaracharya, Ramanuja, who has much more that idea, that element of love, that element of being. That's why Ramanuja begins with his philosophy, the whole Bhakti tradition in Hinduism, which, of course, was very much influenced by Persian poetry in the first place. And, of course, all the Western religions have this idea of the human personality in some way or other surviving in an ultimate divine reality, if that has been if they have lived according. You know, that whole idea which they say about heaven and hell, which of course is a very elementary kind of imagery. But after all, that fire indeed means a kind of transformation into nothingness. But the other, that paradise, again, a very naive representation, but still it is something which a contemplation of beauty, of joy, gives a certain fulfillment. So on what do you focus? Where is your own possibility of transcending your ego? Because it is the ego which will die. When one is always determined by one's ego, then there's little expectation that once liberated from that ego, one still is able to function, to absorb in that divine reality one's own ultimate being. The drop can merge into the ocean and maybe perfectly find its fulfillment in that entirely. At the same time, if there has been that kind of self-sacrificing love, that kind of ego-transcending love, then there's always that chance of, being again revived as that drop in the ocean of divine reality. That is another aspect, and as I say, that's maybe not so much the Indian as the Islamic aspect of the Sufi tradition of the metaphysical reality. But, some strange thing which surprised me always, of course, these oldest Indian traditions were extremely valuable, extremely respectable, extremely lovable, but they were very, very old, very ancient. And when we look at the Western traditions, from Zoroastrian and Jewish, Christian, Islamic, then there's suddenly that idea of the human personality as a moral entity as such becomes very strong. There already you find a beginning of kind of individualism, which is kind of distinct of the way in which the traditional religions of the East, Buddhism, Taoism, certain schools of Hindu philosophy proceeded with. You have to, and I cannot see that larger value on the single human being as it developed in the Western religions should be inferior to those concepts which we find in the Eastern. Rather, I would suppose it would be a bit different in that way. We can also say that the Oriental religions, and I mean, I'm speaking now about certain Hindu schools like the Sankhya, like Buddhism, like Taoism, and these, where it all transcends the human entity as such, but in a way they give an analytical concept, and which is perfectly valid, but an analysis is something else from an empirical reality. That the empirical reality has a greater, relates itself to an analytical one, as, let us say, a skeleton to a human being. Now, we all like very much, we want to have our doctors and our chemists and all those kind of people. We want them to be analysts. We want to look at our skeletons, and we don't want to look at them at all. But we ask of our specialists, medics, they should know all that. Fine. But we do not identify, preferably not with skeletons, but with the human being we happen to be. So, in addition to the analytical understanding, there is the substantive. Well, substantive is not quite a good word, but still, there's that kind of totality of being. And I think this kind of balance, both of them necessary, both of them valuable in their own way, has to be maintained in Sufism, in our metaphysical thinking, and in our esoteric method. Excuse me again for talking too much, but I warned you about my vulnerability.
Well, if I had my way, we would be here all day and into the night.
Everyone would fall asleep.
Thank you so much. Really, this has been a remarkable journey into Shaikh al Mashaik, into your mind, into your heart, into your soul. And it's a tremendous gift to all of us. Could we just take a moment and in silence take in and assimilate all that has been shared with us today? And now, as a last favor, Shaikh al Mashaik, may I ask you to give your blessing to all of us here.
Let us invoke the blessing, and as our Pir Hazrat Inayat has given that in these wonderfully inspiring words, which I love to repeat at every possible occasion, in his hymn of song. Praise be to thee, most supreme God, omnipotent, omnipresent, all-pervading, the only being. Pour upon us thy love and thy light. Give sustenance to our bodies, hearts, and souls. Use us for the purpose that thy wisdom chooseth, and guide us on the path of thine own goodness. Draw us closer to thee every moment of our lives, until in us be reflected thy grace, thy glory, thy wisdom, thy joy, and thy peace. Amen. May the blessing of Moshe's words and the inspiration they carry forever be with you and inspire you ever further on this blessed path of inner realization, inshallah.